Welcome, friends, to this episode of the Sync Your Life podcast. Today, I have my new friend, Lilly Rachel's with me, and I'm so excited to dive into our interview. We've had the chance to touch base prior to this call, and I know she has a lot of value to bring to my audience and a lot of things that you guys will take away from this. So I'm going to dive right in. I'd love for you to just sort of share your story. Who are you day to day, and what brought you to what you're doing now?
Okay. Well, my story starts back in 2008. I was in a really bad car wreck the day of high school graduation. And about 7 weeks in a neck brace, a sling, the whole 9 yards. And when I started college, instead of going nursing school, which was the direction I was heading, I was like, exercise science and wellness. I never want to stop moving again as soon as I recover. So after college, I started personal training and I loved it. I thought I found my dream job. And then I realized I had bills to pay. So I pivoted and started working in the corporate world. And for me, that was a little life draining. So I was looking for something to scratch that itch that personal training did. And I found yoga. So I went through teacher training and then trauma sensitive yoga teacher training. And I fell in love with the mind-body connection. So eventually I went back to school because I was like, I want to help people and I want to also do it in maybe a talk therapy way. So I got my master's in social work and I began working as a therapist for a little while. And then COVID happened. So I pivoted again and I went into podcasting and growth coaching. And I was kind of brought to that through a series of other things that occurred in my life. I lost my mother unexpectedly, went through a divorce, and that's how Growth Over Easy was built.
Yeah, so you have your own podcast, Growth Over Easy, which we'll make sure we link up in the show notes. I remember when we chatted before. I love it in general when people take their mess and turn it into their message, really. So, right? And I'm the same way. And ironically, we both have sort of a similar experience being introduced to yoga the same way. And yoga has been a game changer for me. But I love when people are able to take a struggle and turn it into their message and to really, reach out to other people with it. So I would love for you to just tell us more about, more specifically about like what yoga has done for you in making that mind-body connection.
So for me, when I started doing yoga, I'd kind of dabbled in it through college. And then I met a girlfriend who was like, you should just go through teacher training with me. And when I started that was the first time I really got into, I would say, that mind-body connection in the breathing. And I remember the first few times in Shavasana just crying because it was finally the release that I needed from all the things I was holding on to. And then when I decided to do the trauma sensitive yoga, that tapped into a whole new world for me, that this could not only help people, get more flexible and calm their mind, but actually move grief out of the body.
Yeah. How does that work? I mean, I've been exposed to, Vinyasa yoga is sort of my yoga of choice, but this idea of like trauma informed yoga is intriguing to me. Can you tell us more about the approach with that?
Yeah. So when I did it, I taught mainly at a domestic violence halfway house. So for the asana, like the posture difference, I would always keep them out of super vulnerable feeling positions, just because it needed to feel safer for the women there. So that was like more of the physical aspect. And then I would say it was just more so focused on the breath and noticing. So we would spend a lot of time like, okay, your feet are planted on the floor. Let's like notice what that feels like, because you're trying to pull people back into that frontal lobe way of thinking instead of thinking in more of that temporal, like kind of fight or flight. We're trying to bring them back into their body. So the emphasis was just more on, let's notice our environment around us. Let's notice how this posture feels in our body right now. And then if the class was small enough, I'd even have people name that out loud.
It's so interesting to me. I had the pleasure of interviewing Natalia Rachel. I'm not sure if you've been connected to her yet or not, but I'd love to connect you to, if not. And she was talking about this whole concept of safety and helping people feel safe in order to get to the place that they need to get to emotionally and with their mindset. And it's interesting to me because I can remember even just in my sort of like power vinyasa flow classes that I've taken, the instructor most instructors tend to be very cognizant of how people are feeling in that moment, because not
Mhm.
everybody can be still, right? Like I'm raising
Yep.
my
Mhm.
I know you guys can't see me, but I'm raising my hand because I struggle with stillness and quieting the mind. And so this idea of safety, right? Like feeling your body melt into the earth, so to speak, or to feel your
Mhm.
feet planted. I remember one phrase, and it's interesting because this phrase pops up in my mind so much, and it came from a yoga class. And it was when my yoga instructor made the comment, she said, we were in Shavasana one day, and Shavasana is like my nemesis pose, right? Like I do not
Because
want,
you have to be
I don't want
still.
to lay still. Like, how long is this
Mhm.
going to take? And she said, just notice that you're safe here. Like you're safe here on the
Mhm.
floor, and you can always return here. And that phrase, like for some reason, even, I mean, I've been dealing with COVID for the last week and a half in isolation from my family. And because we were really hoping to go on a trip and I didn't want to get anybody sick. And so
Yeah.
talk about like a mental head game, like being alone in your in your bedroom
Yeah.
for like 10 days is a head game, right? But like for me, it was like I did a yoga flow one morning when I was feeling pretty good. And I just remember laying there on the floor and thinking, like, I can always return here. Like there's some sort of like safety message in that, right? That makes you feel like this isn't so bad. Like maybe I
Mhm.
should just embrace this and just let it be and just and lay in this moment. So are you, so I love to talk to yoga people who are also, you know, it's because I think a lot of people have this sort of misnomer or this myth that like, you know, some people are really good at stillness and meditation and or they're very good at quieting the mind, when in reality a lot of people that I meet that are into yoga are quite the opposite, and they do it
Yes.
because it's a challenge. So I'd love for you to touch on that for us.
No, I completely agree with that because I'm not naturally someone who likes to be still. I like physically, I like to move. Mentally, I feel like my mind is always going. I'm always working on something. And that was more of the practice in yoga for me. Like the postures came not easily, but I was athletic as a child. So that part wasn't as difficult, but it's the quieting, like you said, the shavasana, the holding of poses. I don't know if you've ever been in a class where they'll put you in warrior two for like 2 minutes. And
Feels like 2 hours.
exactly. And it's not so much just the muscle burn, but it's that mental staying power.
Yeah.
And that's what I believe yoga really brought to my life was the ability to sit in the uncomfortable.
Yes.
And then I was able to use that when I would have, difficult things that would come up in life. I got more used to sitting in the uncomfortable. I'm a strong Enneagram 7, so I like to run away from negative emotion and pain, and yoga taught me just to be still.
Yes, that makes me think of the fact that I know for me, even on my fitness journey, you know, they say a lot of times that your mind quits before the body
Mhm.
quits, right? And
Yeah.
yoga, because you are forced to slow down, you really get to see that on steroids because when
Mhm.
you're holding that warrior two, you're thinking to yourself like, well, I can't make it. I can't make it. That's mental,
Yeah.
right? Like that is not a physical thing. And I see so many people struggle with that, myself included. I mean, sometimes I have to convince myself like,
Mhm.
is this my body telling me I can't go, or is this my mind telling me that I can't go? And the other thing that I love too is just whether it's yoga or for me, it's like lifting weights, and I love to work out. Fitness has taught me so much just about how life works in general. Like
Mhm.
if you can get yourself through a really tough workout, right? Or you feel that sort of emotional release or a boost in endorphins, you realize that like, gosh, if I can get through this, like then how much of that applies to my life, right? Like how much
Yes.
of my life can I equate to just that tough workout, right? Like if I can do
Mhm.
that, I can do anything. So you mentioned, you know, you've had sort of a roller coaster, it sounds like, of just experiences. And I love this idea of growth over easy. I love the idea of not just grieving, but growing through the grief. So
Mhm.
I'd love to hear your perspective on, you know, how this has shaped you and what you hope to sort of bring light to the world with this message.
Yeah, so back in 2018, I went through a separation and then a divorce, and it was messy and uncomfortable. And during that time, I went out to visit a friend in Colorado, and we did my first ever 14er, which is when you summit one of the mountain peaks over there. And I remember the way up, it was very difficult, the altitude, the air, But once I got to the top, it was just like, like the vista, the view, everything was just peaceful and amazing. And that's when I remember snapping a photo and getting home. And I think it was on Instagram. I wrote the caption, "Pain has the potential to produce more growth than happiness ever could." And I just leaned into that as I was, going through that divorce. And it wasn't because it's like I didn't want the pain. The pain wasn't easy, but I realized that I had the opportunity to get stronger and be better and work on myself in that time. So I would say that's when I just really leaned into my own personal growth.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been following this gal on Instagram who just summited Mount Everest.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Goodness gracious. Like I can't even bring myself to watch the videos like in her stories because it's so intense. She's got,
Hmm.
looks like her toes are falling off basically. And I'm just thinking, but and it's moments like that where you're like, we can do some pretty amazing things. You know what I mean? Like, I mean,
Absolutely.
I think a lot of people, and I think it comes back to that, like, what are the cycles in our brain that we're living with? Like, what are the things that we can't get out of? What are the loops that are sort of stuck in our brain that prevent us from summiting that mountain, regardless of what mountain it is, right? Like, and I just sometimes when I look around and I see what humans are able to do, it's so amazing. And I'm not just talking physical, right? Like I'm
Hmm.
talking about just spiritually, emotionally, like all over the place. But I just think it's so cool that what the one thing that I remember someone said to me one time, this was been probably a couple of years ago, was that trauma connects us, right? And
Hmm.
that grief connects us. Like we all have that shared experience. I'll never forget
Yeah.
that I went to this way back in the day. This has probably been 10 years ago. I went to I don't know what it was, not a concert, but like a performance or whatever with Rob Bell. And the activity that he had us do was he had a note card under your chair for each person in the audience. And he had everybody write on that note card that you had to write with your non-dominant hand, and you had to write, "I know how you feel." And then he
Hmm.
had you pass that card around the room. Basically, you passed it left, you passed it right, right. And
Hmm.
his whole purpose in that message was to share that we all share what it feels like to have pain. We all share what it feels like to have trauma and to have grief. And I mean, it sounds so obvious, right? Like, of course we do, but until you hear that sometimes, and until you have that sort of like for me, that activity really called it to light. It was like, yeah, like we do all have trauma, right? We do all have, maybe not the same, but we
Hmm.
do have levels of pain. So I would love for you to just talk about like, how do people grow through their grief?
Yeah. So I think the first step is admitting where you are and allowing yourself to feel. I know for me personally, my tendency is to avoid and to run away from it because I don't want to have to face the reality of the situation. And so the first step is, and that's what I have clients do, is pinpoint where you are, like the messy, the ugly. Let's talk about like what's going on right now. And then let's pick the point on where you want to be. I remember I did this in therapy myself before where I wrote down a list of words like, this is what I want to feel in life. So that way you have like an anchor in the future of this is what I'm going towards. And then I like to think of the process of going through grief and back to mountains as you're hiking up a mountain. And there's different ways to do this. Your grief is like rocks, and you could pick up every rock on your way up, and it's going to get really hard to get to the top because you're going to be heavy. So I like to think of it as sitting down. Like I'm going to sit down with my pain. I'm going to let myself feel it. I'm going to let myself process it so that way I can let it go. Because the first step is acknowledging it and then allowing yourself to feel that pain, not denying it. And I know for me personally, it's the mental game of I'm just going to decide that I'm okay and I'm going to like move on mentally. But it doesn't work that way. If your heart is still, back there with your pain, you're not going to be able to make your way up the mountain. So, first, acknowledge, feel, process. And then what I have people do is I kind of fill up your tool bag of ways to help you cope while you're experiencing negative emotions, whether that be a physical practice is always a big one on there, whether it's, if you can just get up today and go for a walk, like that's enough. If you could hit a yoga class, that would be great. If you want to go for a run or lift weights, but something to move your body, something to nourish your body, so something good for you. and something to quiet your mind. And for me, that's typically meditation. And it's like the wash, rinse, repeat kind of cycle on day after day. We're just trying to move the needle a little bit. And also accepting that grief, I don't believe ever truly leaves. I think of it as almost a stream of water that's going through you. And when we deny that something bad has happened or we try to push it down, it's like damming up that water. And that's when you drown. But when we let it flow through us and we let those feelings come up and we process them as we do, and we work the plan, we move, we nourish, we quiet our mind, we reach out to our support group, the water recedes. And it's always kind of there. Like it might just be a creek because there's always a loss, right? Especially if you've lost someone. Like I don't know anyone that's ever been like, oh, I don't even care anymore that I lost this person. Like it's always there. It's kind of a part of you, but it's the dichotomy of allowing yourself to move forward and grow while simultaneously feeling that sadness.
Yeah, gosh, there's a lot there. I think a lot of the first thing that I'll start with is just, I mean, I think I had sort of just a moment because I realized that, how much of struggling with grief is brought about by our own resistance,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like what you just said was what I gathered from the water analogy, like letting it flow through you. And I also love the analogy of not carrying the rocks with you, right? Because of course that's going to weigh you down. How much of, how many people are sort of stuck with resisting that water flowing through them, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
they feel the emotion enough to be scared, enough to be I think scared or fearful is the right word, and then they just shut down, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I think, I mean, I can speak from my own experience. Fortunately I've not had any sort of emergency trauma situations, but I can think back in my life to, one particular moment comes to my mind with my father, who was very active in my life. And he owned a trucking company. And one day he came home from driving a truck and I wanted him to play basketball with me in the front yard. And he came home covered in bruises
Oh.
and said, I just don't feel very well. And within 24 hours, he was given 2 weeks to live. Was diagnosed with leukemia, and our world, my brother and I, my mom, was just turned upside down. Like it went from just,
Yeah.
working the 9 to 5, living the life, going to school, to who's going to care for my brother and I while they seek medical treatment, and so for me, it was a big moment in my life. And of course I was young at the time. I think I was 12. And so these memories of these sort of traumatic experiences, like these things that sort of live with me, have to live with me. It's not like, it's like you said, like they don't disappear, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't go away, but how can I just sort of like let them happen? And how can I feel those emotions anyway? I love that analogy. I'm also interested in just wondering what your perspective is on, as someone is growing through their grief and continuing to live with this sort of water flowing through them, what role does relationships play in that? Like connection with other humans?
Yeah, I would say a very important one because I mean, we're pack animals. And I truly believe it's easier to get through things when you have a system of support. What I normally have people do is like identify 1 to 2 people who you feel comfortable being incredibly vulnerable with. It won't be everybody in life because that doesn't feel safe to most people, right? We don't want to just be this open floodgate of all the mess that's going on in my life. But identifying 1 or 2 people and also asking them if you can lean on them for support, because it gets really heavy to try to carry everything by yourself. And I know times in my life when I've tried, that's when I've started to drown.
Mm.
So identify 1 to 2 people. And when people are like, well, I don't have anyone, I'm like, a friend, a coworker, a family member. And if they say no, I'm like, well, that's when you need to identify a professional, like a coach, a therapist, but somebody that you can be messy with,
Mhm.
that can support you and who will also check on you,
Yeah.
because that's key. That's the reaching out, um, and not just taking "I'm fine" for an answer.
Yeah. how are you really, right? How are you? So
Exactly.
how are you really?
Exactly.
Yeah, I remember hearing somebody say that one time too, is, how many times do we get on an elevator and we like make small talk with somebody and we're like, hey, how are you? And they're like, fine, you, fine.
Yeah.
I'll
Oh, I'm
just go
good.
about our day, but deep down, maybe like something horrible is affecting our mind, but we're just like, oh, we're fine, So having somebody to ask no, how are you really? To dig a little bit deeper and to be there. So let's say that you are that person for somebody. Let's say that you are, sort of the friend who the trauma sufferer, so to speak, is feeling vulnerable with. What types of things can you do aside from just sitting and being with them? Like, what types of things can you say? What types of things can you do to really help that person, continue to grow through their grief?
Yes. First, I would say if you are that person for someone, you have to make sure you're taking care of yourself as well, because it is also very heavy and it's a large role to play to support someone when they've experienced something, devastating in their life. So make sure you're taking care of yourself. And then I always tell people to reach out and then reach out again, because like you said, it's very easy. And I know I've been there. People are like, oh, can I do anything for you? You're like, no, I'm good. I'm good. So I say, like, reach out in a tangible way instead of saying, like, how are you? Can I bring you food? You reach out and say, hey, I made this. I'm going to drop it off on your front porch. Is today okay? Or would you rather it be tomorrow? Um, Especially if you're that close person in their life, you kind of know when you can kind of push in to help,
Mhm.
because it's very difficult for the person that's grieving to identify what they want and need. I
Yeah.
know when I lost my mom, I had a lot of people asking, like, what do you need? And I'm like, I don't know what I need. I need my life to be, the way it was before this event. But the friends and family members that could just kind of not even foresee the need, but just offer help and continue to offer it. And the last thing would be, you kind of have to develop, um, be a little, or a thicker skin, or don't take things personally, because when you're helping someone who's experienced something devastating, sometimes they can be harsh or mean, or they can lash out. And it's realizing that it's not about you. In fact, it has nothing to do with you. It's everything to do with what they're going through.
Yeah.
So take care of yourself and just continue to reach out in a tangible way. And sometimes it's just sitting there.
Yeah. No, that's powerful. I think of moments in my life where someone has confided in me that they're struggling.
Hmm.
Sometimes I think it's very difficult to be that person that they're confiding in, because sometimes you want to say the right thing, or you want to ask the right questions, or you want to point them in the right direction of the right help. And sometimes you're like, oh my gosh, like I feel like it's falling on me now. Right. And so I love your advice of like making sure you're taking care of yourself. And I remember hearing somebody say one time that like sometimes just voicing to someone the way you're feeling and receiving it, like being able to say back to the person, I realize right now that there's really no right words to say. So I'm just going to sit here and I'm going
Hmm.
to listen. And if you need me to do something, or you need me to hug you or whatever, like, please tell me what to do, because I want to do the right thing. So
Hmm.
sometimes just that transparency, right? Of saying like, I'm not sure how to help, but I'm going to sit
Yeah.
here and I'm going to do my best. Right.
Yeah. And that, because that transparency is important, because it's also, don't be so afraid to do the wrong thing that you do nothing.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
Yeah, I think we hold ourselves back sometimes. We're like, oh, I want to help, I want to reach out, but I don't know how to say it. It's like, say it messy.
Yeah. Yeah. I think about the times when I've lost loved ones, and it's like, for some reason, we kind of coming back to that idea where we talk about, we were talking about trauma connecting us, right? Like, we've all
Mhm.
had grief. We've all lost somebody that we love. And it's interesting to me how in those moments, which essentially are what connects us to other humans, right? Like, other humans have experienced this type of pain. Sometimes those are when we're most speechless, because we don't know
Mhm.
what to say. And it's like, it's 1,000% because we are feeling it. Like, sometimes I feel like
Mhm.
we're feeling it vicariously through, even though it wasn't our loved one, we feel that pain so
Yeah.
much that we don't know what to say. You mentioned briefly a few minutes ago, talking about, as you're summiting the mountain, um, finding small ways of coping as you let the water run through you. What mechanisms are there for coping that you would recommend people consider?
Yeah. So one of the first things I tell people is to find a healthy distraction tool. For me, it's always been puzzles. I only do puzzles when I'm going through something hard, and it's something that involves, I would say, no screens, no technology, that involves fine motor skills to help de-escalate you. And whether it's you need to de-escalate yourself because you're, hyperventilating, crying, or you're just feeling this deep, dark kind of depression, it's something to get your brain to focus on to give you a break from what you're feeling. I mean, I've had clients that'll start knitting or painting or something. It doesn't have to be artistic, but something that is good for you, that uses fine motor skills and can help distract you just when things start to become overwhelming.
Yeah, that's really good. I think sometimes doing something that's distracting is helpful.
Hmm.
I'm also, in my mind right now, because we're having this conversation, at the time that we're having this conversation, I can't help but think about the tragedy that just happened in Texas
Mm.
and what those families are going through. But I'm, as a mother, like they say, once a mother, always a mother. Um, I never used to, like, I used to be able to watch movies, and something would happen to a child, and of course it would affect me, but it affects me on a deeper level now. I feel like I can't even watch movies that have sick children or hurt children without it feeling like it's my child.
Mhm.
But so this entire experience that's happened in Texas, and I don't want to dwell on it for too long on the podcast, but just thinking about that type of tragedy that's happened, and specifically how kids are exposed to that, and really all different levels of grief. As a parent myself, and I know because a lot of my listeners are probably moms, what are some ways that you can sort of pick up on grief in children, and what are some things that you can do, with your child if they're going through the grieving process?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. Um, One of the kind of telltale signs is you'll look for behavior change. And this can be seen a lot in young kids, that if they've experienced something that you don't even know about, if I always say to a parent, like, if you've ever noticed like kind of a more sudden behavior change, like, oh, Lucy used to be really talkative and now she's gotten really quiet, like, that's something to explore. So
Mhm.
I'd look for different behavior changes, whether that's in just their day to day, like how they're acting, or what, they're eating, they're sleeping. So look for that. And then allowing them to talk about it by you first talking about it. So obviously, you wouldn't talk to a child the same way you would an adult. You'd use different language. You probably wouldn't go into as much detail,
Yeah.
but letting your child know how it affected you, and it makes a safe environment for them to then process and feel their feelings. So if you're like, if they see you and you've just watched the news and you know what happened, and you look sad and your kid's like, oh, what's wrong with mommy? You tell them, like, mommy's sad. And why is mommy sad? Because someone, did a really bad thing and hurt kids, and allow them to feel safe to also explore their own emotions. Because a lot of times we try to hide our grief and our problems from children to protect them. But the safety comes in allowing ourselves to feel things. And again, it's not the same language you would use if you were talking to one of your friends, but it's allowing them to see the emotion in you and the sadness in you, can
Yeah.
then help them share.
Yeah, that's something that Natalia mentioned, was how children really pick up on your nervous system, right? Like how
Hmm.
you're controlling your emotions and how you're feeling about things.
Yeah, you're the tuning fork for them.
Yeah. So just last week, I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago, we came upon our 2-year anniversary of our dog passing away, which was our
Mm.
golden retriever. And my 5.5-year-old was old enough to, obviously remember him and know him. And she
Yeah.
was upset when he passed, even though she was upset probably because we were upset mostly. But it was interesting because my Facebook memories had popped up with, pictures saying that it was a year ago today. And of course, then it was 2 years ago today. And so I started crying like out of nowhere, just because he was my dog.
Hmm.
And she was just like, Mama, my daughter was like, Mama, what's wrong? And I was like, I have two choices in that moment. right?
Yeah.
I have one choice to be like, oh, nothing, no, I'm good, everything's fine, right? And just sort of brush it off, which then of course teaches her that if you're feeling sad, you should hide it, or you should,
Hmm.
that whole thing. And so I was like, okay, I'm not usually an emotional person, but dogs, man, they get you.
They do.
And so I was like, well, today, and I told her, I was like, today's the day that Rudy died 2 years ago. And she just immediately erupted into tears.
Oh,
And it is so interesting how, that openness and that vulnerability and being able to show that to your children, like it makes you a different person, right? Like I
yeah.
really would have just been like, oh no, I'm good, I'm fine, I'm fine. But then in that moment, I'm asking myself, what's the best response for my child so that she knows it's okay to feel these feelings, right?
Yeah. She knows that it's okay to feel them, and also that those feelings are not her fault, because kids can internalize a lot of that and just assume fault for their parents' feelings and behavior, whether they ever verbalize it or not.
Yeah.
So it's like, by you sharing, it's like she knows it's not her, and she also knows it's okay to
Yeah.
be sad.
Yeah. And I think too, just the time, right now coming out, I would say coming out of this pandemic, but clearly maybe we're not out of it
Yeah,
fully.
we'll see.
but regardless, like, she's fortunate enough that she's gone to an outdoor school, so she hasn't been masked or anything like that. But I know obviously lots of millions of kids have been masked through school.
Mhm.
And there's these sort of, rules that have been put into place for the last few years about you got to be distanced from your friends and you've got to have a mask on, you got to do this and that, right? And I remember there being this particular day at preschool where they had like a little reunion, and her friend from last year had come for this reunion, and she was so excited because this was like her
Yeah.
little best friend, and her friend gets out of the car, and her friend had been, in kindergarten. She's a year older than Ellery, and so she was used to the masking and the distancing and all that kind of stuff because she's in the big kids school now. And so she comes running out of the car, and the two of them, I wish I would have had it on video, like the two of them are just like running to each other and just couldn't wait to see each other. And they're just running full force, full force, full force. And they get about 10 feet apart and they both stop. And the little girl looks at her mom, Ellery looks at me with
Oh.
this like look of like permission, like, is it okay
Yeah.
to hug her? Right. And in that moment, it made me think like our children have been so impacted by the last 2 to 3 years, well
Yes.
beyond what we will ever know. I mean,
Hmm.
if I take her with me anywhere in the car, it's, do I need to wear my mask? Where's the sanitizer? Like, why don't we have the sanitizer? Like, she's so
Yeah.
overly concerned about everything and germs and touching other people that I can't help but think like, how's that impacting our human connection? Right. And
Hmm.
so we could talk about that until we're blue in the face, but it just made me think, if our children are picking up so much on our nervous system, if they're picking up on our responses and reactions to things and our emotions to things and our fear of things, how much does that impact them?
Yes, and I would say greatly. And again, that comes to parents getting to be the tuning fork, and the way that you respond to something is going to help her build that resilience and how she can respond to something. But yeah, I do too. The social connection and everything going digital, I think it'll be really interesting to see years down the road how that has affected um, kids. And that makes me really sad, because that's, well, as you know, it's like the most important years of their life as their brains are growing and developing, and to not get to have that social connection.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I could say the same for my 18-month-old. I take her to play class, and the place that we go to play class still requires masking for adults. And we don't obviously wear masks at home, and she doesn't go really anywhere else. And so it's interesting because we go to that class and she's so happy-go-lucky, she doesn't care, but
Hmm.
she looks at me like, why are you in that? Like, what is
Yeah,
happening? Like, what is, yeah. And, all the adults are looking at her like, hi, aren't you cute? And I can't help but think she's looking at them like Walter
I don't
White.
understand.
You know what I mean? Like she's like
Yeah.
petrified by the mask.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's impacting our children. And I think sometimes, like you said, like seeing something on the news, children have questions. They see the TV, they see what you're watching or what you're listening to or how you feel about things, and then it causes fear in them too. So, okay. So one thing that I wanted to ask you, just resources. So obviously I do want to point people in the direction of your podcast, and we'll get to that. We'll link everything up in the show notes, and we'll talk about that here at the end. But aside from that, what other resources are there for people to just be sort of feeding their mind positive thoughts? Like, what are some of your favorite resources for, struggling through grief, for either yourself or your children?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm a big book person, so I read a lot of books. I'm trying to think of one of the better ones I read during that process. I'm currently reading The Happiness Advantage, which in general is a great book for anyone to read. I'm trying to think resources. Are you talking more like material, like books, podcasts?
Yeah, books, podcasts, like Audible books, whatever, anything that people can sort of plug into. I know for me, like if I can, if I'm struggling with something in particular, right? Like I can, for this is such a silly example, but for me, sometimes it's a matter of I'm a night owl and
Mm-hmm.
I'm not good in the mornings, but I know that I can be productive in the mornings. And sometimes I need that extra kick, right? So Mel Robbins, 5-second rule,
Oh,
as
that's a good
cool as
book.
it is, right? Like stuff like that to just get me going, or Miracle Morning to get me focused on gratitude and journaling and making that a routine. Like, so I realize that those are sort of personal growth oriented, but I was just wondering in the realm of like, grief and growing through your grief, like what personal growth tools are out there for people when it comes to that?
A book I read recently, it was Unstuck by Bob Goff.
Yeah.
And he is definitely, or sorry, undistractable, not unstuck, undistractable. And he's definitely, I would say, an optimist in his own right. But he talks about a lot in that book, like allowing yourself to kind of take down that guard and that mask that you put out into the world and truly be yourself and allow other people to see all those sides of you. Because I feel like we do that in general. We kind of want to hide what's going on and put the pretty face out in the world. And that book really talked about like taking that down,
Okay.
and not being distracted in general. And then another good one, looking through my books now, I have a
Yeah, and
bunch
you know what?
that
I'm glad you said Bob Goff because I'm pretty sure, and I'll have to look it up and I'll put it in the show notes, but I'm pretty sure he has a children's book as well. Um,
I believe he does.
and he has, I think, is it Love Does is his other book. I've loved his stuff. And
Love Does and Everybody Always. Yes, I've
yes,
read, I
I
think.
follow him on social too. It's he seems to have the right words in moments, right? Like I just noticed after the Texas shootings, he was putting up some content that just like hits you in all the feels. So that's a great resource. We'll definitely link that up in the show notes. And honestly, if you have anything that you think of later that you wanted to send us, we can put a list in the show notes.
No, I will definitely do that.
But I just think, yeah, I think it's powerful to, number one, surround yourself with people you can feel vulnerable with, right? If you're struggling, asking the right questions and letting yourself feel. Like we've talked about so many different things. You've mentioned phrases like lean in, know where you are. We talked about the mind quitting long before the body does. So I love everything you've had to say. I think everything that you've mentioned is so powerful and so helpful for anyone listening. All of us have struggled through grief, and some are in the thick of it, right? As they're listening to this, they're in the thick of it. So this is going to hit them right where they are. Others know that that grief is part of life. And so they know that at some point, this is going to be a valuable resource for them. So I'd love to just sort of wrap it up with knowing from you and asking you, what ways have you grown through all these different experiences that you've had and in launching your podcast and everything you're out doing in the world? What are some ways that you found yourself growing in the last few years?
The biggest thing for me in dealing with, divorce and deaths and more deaths is I've developed more compassion for people around me. And I think when we allow ourselves to, really get messy with where we are in the grief and truly process and feel those things, feel anger, feel the sadness, feel the confusion. And when we come out of that, we cultivate so much more compassion in our life for other people because we realize, like you said, that shared trauma, like everybody's going through something. It might not be like horrific child abuse. It could have been something that we would consider smaller, but that doesn't matter because it affected them and their brain and their body and their soul, just like whatever you went through affected you. And so for me, it's like developing more compassion. That's what if I had to sum up what all the the pain and turmoil in life has done for me is it's given me the sense of just grace for other people. And when, someone cuts me off in traffic or is maybe rude at the grocery store, it's so much easier to just breathe and be like, just give them grace, because we have no idea what someone else is experiencing. And we all could use an extra measure of grace in our lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just last week, my daughter came home from preschool and she'd had a rough day with one of the kids at school. And she said, I don't know what the deal is. Like, she just was so mean to me today. And she was just couldn't get over it. Right. And so we had to have a little moment where we talked about, you can only control how you respond to situations and how you react. And perhaps that other person was having a bad day. Like, perhaps that other person didn't get a hug from their mommy on the way out the door, or maybe they woke up on the wrong side of the bed, right? Like, whatever the case is, it's not on you, but it is on you to love them through it and to say, you know what, if you need your space today, then you need your space today. And I heard this, Brendan Burchard has these short little episodes on his podcast that I love. And he was talking about recently about, next time that you're in an argument with somebody, just remember that that person is bringing trauma into that argument that you've never seen and that you don't understand. And you're bringing your own trauma into that argument that they've never seen and they don't understand. And so how powerful is that, right? To have that perspective. And so I think compassion, ultimately, if there's no better way to grow through something, it's in, establishing that compassion for yourself and for other people, and being able to face the world another day and take that with you. So I would love for you to point people in the direction of both the podcast and anything else you want them to know about you and where they can find you.
Yeah. So the podcast is Growth Over Easy. It's on all platforms. I'm most active on TikTok. It's just my name, Lilly Rachels, and Growth Over Easy on Instagram.
Awesome. We will link all that up in the show notes. I will have to check out your TikTok. I'm a TikTok lurker, but not a TikToker.
I mean, it's pretty much just Instagram reels on, but yeah, so it's, I feel like Instagram is kind of the same now.
Yeah, that's so funny. Yeah, they're so entertaining. Okay, cool. Well, I will link all that up in the show notes. That way people can find you easily and check out the podcast and everything. But thank you so much for doing this interview. And I'm so glad our paths have crossed. You are a powerhouse and you are changing so many lives through what you do. I think this is such a powerful message that needs to be heard.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Have a good one.
You too.